All right, guys. Welcome. Here we are. So study 17. We're going to finish it up today. That's the plan. And we're wrapping up the Augsburg Confession with part 2, which is where Melanchthon starts getting into some of the particular issues that were causing trouble. He calls these the disputed articles, listing the abuses that have been corrected. And I told you that this is very much historically grounded, because what Melanchthon is doing is he's laying down some of the issues that were really hotly debated at that time. And he's explaining why the Lutherans actually made some changes from what people were used to, and why they had to make those changes, because people were often complaining, saying, you're changing everything. And so Melanchthon's just saying, well, here we had to change some things, and here's why. So that's what's going on. Okay. All right, good. So last time we covered the first two, Article 22 and Article 23. So now we're ready to start tonight or this afternoon with Article 24, and that's titled what? It's on Kolbinger, page 68, concerning the Mass. All right, now we've talked about everything in these articles we have already addressed, because every one of these issues is dealing with theology that Melanchthon covers in part 1. So now he's just applying the theology that he's been teaching. So what did we mean when we say the Mass? What's he talking about there? Titus?
The church service.
The church service. Specifically what? Oliver, you got anything else to add to that? Go ahead, Oliver.
Like the blessing that they do, sort of. I forget.
The what things?
Like the blessing that they do.
Yeah, so the prayers, the rites, the rituals.
In front of the whole town. In
what,
front of
Hadley?
the whole, they do it like in front of the whole town, so everybody gets like a blessing.
Yeah, okay. The idea here, the Mass is specifically thinking about the church service around Holy Communion. That's what the Mass is. The service around Holy Communion. That's the special focus. That's the special interest. So it's not just any church service, but it's the church service with the Lord's Supper, okay? So that's what the Mass is. When people say we're going to celebrate Mass, what they mean is Holy Communion church service. All right, so every time now, what I'm going to be doing in each of these, remember, we're going to talk about what's going on and then why does it matter. So here's what's going on. In the medieval church, which is the church that was happening, that Luther was growing up in, that everybody knew, it had been this way for several hundred years. In the church of that time, remember, there's only one Christian church in the West. You're just Catholic Church. It's the church, and the Catholic just means universal. So the way that the service is being celebrated, there were several problems that had crept in, and that's what Melanchthon is addressing here. So some of those issues were this. One of the problems was that they had decided that every Mass should always be happening only in Latin, because they decided that was the proper language for doing worship, had to be in Latin. And so that's how they did it, which was fine back in the Roman days when everybody knew Latin. But in the 16th century, in the 1500s, how many German people know Latin?
0.
Yeah, only those who are educated, not very many. And so the common people, the market people and the farmers and the people living in towns would go to church. They didn't understand anything being said. It was all in Latin. And so that's why they would often have little signals of things going on. Like they would ring bells or do things so the people knew what was happening. So they gave little signals to the listeners. And so that was all done in Latin. That was one of the issues. The other big problem was the Roman Catholic Church was still teaching this idea that the Mass itself, participating in it, earned forgiveness or earned God's grace.
Oh.
And so that I went to church and I watched them doing Mass. The idea was that the priest, by saying the right words and by practicing doing the ritual of Mass, he was actually earning forgiveness. And so if I was there watching it happen, I was actually earning forgiveness. And so that idea was a big problem. And so what they did was they changed some things in the German church, and they started introducing German hymns and German songs. Now, Melanchthon says this. Let's look on page 68. I'm going to read the German side under Article 24. Our people have been unjustly accused of having abolished the Mass. So people are saying, you've thrown out the Mass. Go ahead, Oliver.
Well, what I think happened was they're not abolishing the mass. They're saying some of what's going on in the mass is okay, but what they're getting out from the mass is not okay. This is the
That's
part
right.
we're changing.
That's right. That's what Melanchthon is going to say. But it is obvious, without boasting, that the Mass is celebrated among us with greater devotion and earnestness than among our opponents. And the opponents would be the Catholics. So in other words, what Melanchthon is saying, we actually celebrate the Mass better than you guys do. We don't get rid of it. We're still doing it. The people are instructed more regularly with greater diligence concerning the Holy Sacrament. And this way, people are drawn to communion in the Mass. And he says, at the same time, they're also instructed about other false teachings. And he goes on, moreover, no noticeable changes have been made in the public celebration of the Mass, except that in certain places, German hymns are sung alongside the Latin responses for the instruction and exercise of the people. For after all ceremonies should serve the purpose of teaching the people what they need to know about Christ. And so what Melanchthon is saying is, we're not making big changes, but we are adding some changes, and we're changing the teaching about what's going on in the Lord's Supper, that it's not at all earning forgiveness, but it's actually giving grace. And so what's really going on here is we're not treating the Mass like it's the law, but it's gospel. So there are two things I think that, why does this still matter? Why does this doctrine still matter? First one is the confession is recognizing that liturgy has an important role as teaching. So when you go to church and you sit in church and you sing and you do the responses, are you learning about God and learning about the church?
Yes.
The truth is, yes. It might not be Bible class, but even just going through the liturgy, you are being taught. So liturgy is part of the church's teaching. So the Melanchthon recognizes that. And the other thing to recognize here is that the Lord's Supper is gospel and not law. And that comes through here very clearly, and that's important. Titus?
And our one of our hymns last week was this joyful Easter tide. We did the Easter part, and I really liked that second verse. Something about the author of God, the author of life, and Jesus treading the pathway of death. I thought that was really cool.
There are some really cool lines in the hymns, aren't there? And that's a great one. Good. Okay, so that's Article 24, the Mass. So the biggest change here is that we're not going to have to do it only in Latin, and that we're not going to treat the Mass like it's a thing that earns forgiveness. Okay, that's Article 24. Now Article 25. That starts on page 72. And what's the title of this one?
Concerning confession.
All right, concerning confession. And so again, it's the same thing. Let's look at the very first sentence Melanchthon writes on that page on the German side. Confession has not been abolished by the preachers on our side. So again, the implication is people were saying, Lutherans don't do confession anymore. Lutherans don't do the Mass anymore. And so Melanchthon is saying, that's not true. We still celebrate Lord's Supper, and we still practice confession. Now, remember, we talked about confession before, and I told you that in the Reformation time, when it talks about confession and absolution, what do the writers have in mind? What are they thinking about? Do you remember, Hadley?
Private confession.
Hadley, go ahead.
They're thinking about the person telling the pastor and the pastor forgiving them. And they're thinking, oh, so Luther's a new way. He's not doing that anymore. Ooh.
Right. So they're thinking about, as Jude called it, private confession, which is the person saying it one-on-one to the pastor, and they're recognizing we still do this. And so that we're still doing private confession. So that's right. Okay. Oliver?
Now, for us nowadays, this is meaning that we still do private confession, and it's still a good thing, and we should still think about that. But also, we're also thinking about our confession and absolution during the church service.
That's right. That's right. So we also have the general confession. Now, there's one interesting thing I want you to notice here. So we're recognizing then that Lutherans still do private confession. Is private confession still available to this day in 2024?
Yes.
Yes. And if you're ever seeing, if you feel like I really need to talk to somebody about this thing that's bothering me, my conscience is bothering me, private confession is a great thing to do on a still today. And then the important thing is that the key part of it is not the spelling out your sins or enumerating your sins. What's the key part? It's the absolution. It's the giving of forgiveness. All right. Now, I want you to notice one thing that's quite interesting here that still shows up in here. And that is when this talking about how this confession should be going on, it says this, that concerning confession, this is on paragraph 7 on page 72. It is taught that no one should be compelled to enumerate sins in details. You don't have to try to tell every single sin, because who could possibly do that? That's not going to happen. We can't expect that to happen. But then we go to paragraph 13 on page 74. Nevertheless, the preachers on our side, that means the Lutheran preachers, diligently teach that confession is to be retained because of absolution, for the comfort of terrified consciences, and because of other reasons, okay? And so they're saying, yes, it still matters, and we still do practice this. It should still happen. This is important. Why? For comfort, the comfort that comes to us and the certainty that we have forgiveness. That's so very important. Jude?
What are those other reasons?
What do you mean? Other reasons? Oh, because for the comfort and for other reasons, because the other reasons would be just the assurance that I don't have to pay for this sin. I don't have to try to go and make a pilgrimage anymore. I don't have to do anything. It's all covered by God's forgiveness.
Okay.
Okay. Now, there's also the connection that is made here that we still think confession is a good idea before communion. So before you go to communion, good idea to confess your sins and good idea to go to confession. And that we still are going to encourage that because that's a good practice. We don't have to list every single sin, but it's still a good thing to confess your sins before communion. And that's why usually on most communion Sundays, we have the confession of sins in the service. So you confess your sins, then you go and take communion. And so that's a good practice. In the old days, even when I was young, most churches still had the habit that you had to register for communion. And so you would have to like call the pastor or talk to the pastor the week before communion and say, I want to take communion this weekend. But in those days, communion only happened maybe once a month. And when Grandpa Bierman was young, communion would only happen maybe once every 3 or 4 months. It was kind of a rare thing. The idea of doing communion every Sunday didn't happen very often in Lutheran churches. And so when you did, you would often have to register with the pastor, talk to the pastor. And there was even a time not so long ago, maybe 100 years ago or a little more, that if you're going to go to communion, you would have to go and see the pastor and have a meeting with him to let him know you wanted to register for communion. And that was a chance for the pastor to talk to you and for you to maybe talk about anything you needed to talk about. And it was kind of what was left over from doing private confession before you went to communion. And that's kind of how the changes have happened in our own church body. And now we're to the point where really nobody does that at all. And it's just not even a practice. Oliver, go ahead.
You said private confession before communion.
Yeah.
How can, you privately confess with the pastor during the service before you have communion?
Well, see, what they would do is they would actually go and see him during the week and make sure that they had that private confession that happened. And then they would be ready for communion that Sunday. And like I said, in a lot of Lutheran churches, they weren't celebrating communion every Sunday anyway. It was only maybe once a month or maybe twice a month, but usually just once a month. Hadley, go ahead.
That'd be like 50 people coming each day just have for private confession these days.
Right. So the pastor would be kind of busy doing all those meetings, wouldn't he? All right, good. So that's Article 25. Now let's go to Article 26. That's right there, close. This is a little shorter one. Article 26 says, concerning the distinction among foods. Concerning the distinction among foods, okay? And the idea here is, what do you mean distinction among foods? This is where you have the idea of fasting during certain times. Like on Fridays, remember I told you that Roman Catholic
Fish. You had fish.
Only fish on Fridays. Why?
Because they couldn't eat meat.
Can't eat meat. So you can't eat meat on Fridays because you have to fast from your meat on Fridays. So you'd only eat fish or vegetables. That's your distinction. You're making a distinction between foods. You're distinguishing this meat from that meat or this food from that food. So that's what this means. Now, why were they doing this? It was supposed to be to remind them that Jesus was on the cross and he died on Friday, to remind them they should be sorry for their sins. That's where the idea came from. But it soon became kind of twisted around. Look at footnote 163. Footnote 163 on page 74. For example, Thomas Aquinas, and he was a theologian who wrote in the 13th century, in the 1200s, about 300 years before Luther, okay? So Luther knew about Aquinas. For example, Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologiae, wrote this: fasting is practiced for three principal reasons. First, to restrain the concupiscence of the flesh. In other words, to keep your body under control so it doesn't sin so much. Second, because through it, the mind is more easily elevated to the contemplation of sublime things. So that means you're thinking about godly things and about good things. Are those two reasons okay?
Yep.
Yep, those are fine. Third, to make satisfaction for sin.
No.
That one okay?
No.
Not okay. Because remember, satisfaction means what? It means paying for, paying off, making it better. And so the idea here was people thought you could fast and that would pay for your sins or make satisfaction for your sins. And so that's why the reformers said, no, fasting, not eating fish on, only eating fish on Fridays, not eating meat. No, that's missing the whole point. We don't believe in that, and that doesn't matter. And so that's why the distinction among foods was eliminated. And the reformers then basically said that, no, we're not going to do this anymore at all. So on page 80, look at paragraph 40. Our side, he says this right before on page, actually look at paragraph 39, top of page 80. So fasting in itself is not rejected. Instead, we reject making it a required service with prescribed days and foods, for this confuses the consciences. Our side also retains many ceremonies and traditions, such as the order of the Mass and other singing, festivals and the like, which serve to preserve order in the church. So in other words, we'll still do things, and we don't think these things are bad, but when you start saying they're required or they're paying for sins, big problem, okay? Oliver, go ahead.
Is the two things. Is the order of Mass communion?
Yes, the order of Mass is the communion service. It's like the whole divine service is the order of Mass, would be like the communion worship.
And then for the second thing, what do we write down on our worksheet for 25?
Oh, for 25, we still, that about confession?
Yeah. What do we write
Oh,
down?
okay. Okay, sorry, I didn't tell you what to write down. So what was going on under confession, you write down what was going on was that people thought the Lutherans weren't practicing confession anymore.
Okay.
People thought they were abolishing it. Why does it matter? That we still do private confession and that the absolution is the most important thing. So then on 26, on foods, what was going on? People thought they had to fast on certain days, at certain times, and in certain ways. So there were rules about fasting. And why does it matter? Because we know that rituals and fasting are fine, but when you say you have to, that's a problem. Or when you say it forgives sins, that's an even bigger problem. Okay?
Okay.
All right. And now that sets us up for number 27, which is monastic vows. Okay? And monastic vows is a long section. So what was going on? Remember, what is a monk anyway? What does that mean? What's a monk?
A monk is a person who goes and lives in a monastery by himself with some other men, and he usually has a little ring of hair around his head, and he wears a robe or something and cleans and prays and stuff like that. He tries to earn himself his way to God alone.
He what? What'd you say, Jude?
He tries to earn his way to God.
Well, there's that part of it. The bigger issue is the idea that I'm living apart from the rest of the world and I'm doing my own thing now. So monks had this thing, you mentioned this little funny hair, that remember it's called a tonsure. And that was the special haircut where you would shave the top and leave a ring of hair around. That's called a tonsure. That's not that big a deal. The bigger deal is monks always took a vow, and so did nuns. And the vow had three parts. One was a vow of obedience. They had to be completely obedient to whatever their master or the ruler of the monastery or their convent would do. They took a vow of poverty, which they could not have any property besides just a few little things. They had to remain poor. And they took a vow of chastity. So they would never get married and they would never have children. And that was one of their vows they would make, one of their promises. And so these were the vows, the monastic vows. And there were a lot of people who were making these vows. Remember, they made these vows because they thought that that brought them closer to God, as Jude pointed out. And they thought that somehow if I do all these things, then God will love me. And the whole point of the Reformation was, no, 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 no. You don't climb up to God. God comes to you, and you don't need to do any of these vows and try to earn God's favor. And so that's what this article is all about, is the problem of monastic vows. Okay, you got some questions? Oliver, go ahead.
Luther was a monk. He was able to help with this. Maybe
Luther
God
knew
put him
about
in
this
that
from the
circumstance.
inside. That's right.
Maybe God put him in this circumstance. First of all, said he could realize these things. Second of all, he's sort of helpful.
Yes, God works in ways to accomplish his purposes, and things don't happen by accident. And so Luther spent many long, hard years in the monastery. And because of that, he knew exactly what it was like. And so he knew what he was talking about when he talked about these things. That's right. Okay, Titus?
What was the problem with the vow of obedience?
Nothing's wrong with the vow of obedience, except if you're making a vow and you're trusting your vow to the person more than your obedience to Jesus. And so they were a little concerned about letting people become more important than Christ. And that sometimes happened. Okay, Hadley?
So why did they do the tonsure?
The tonsure was to show that you were different and that you were set apart. You were not like normal people. And there's probably more of the history there, but I don't know about it, to be honest. So I guess someday you can research that and learn all about the tonsure if you want to, Hadley. And you can probably do some research and find out about it. Okay, Oliver, go ahead.
What did nuns to stand out from
They would
people?
wear a habit, a certain kind of clothing, a funny little hat. They usually had their hat. Sometimes they would wear something that was so covered up, their hair would be all covered up, and they sometimes only have a little place where their face would show, and everything else was all covered up, and with a special thing called a habit. And that was the special clothes that a nun would wear. Some of them are pretty extravagant, like with little flaps coming off the tops and everything.
Yeah, it's like what the head nuns would have.
Well, if you read, remember your Madeline books, Miss Clavel remember in the Madeline books, you know, the Madeline, the little girl, the
Yeah,
French,
Yeah.
Miss Clavel is a nun.
Oh.
That's why she wears Miss Clavel is a nun. Okay.
And those children, I don't think are her children. She just takes care of them.
Exactly.
Oh,
You didn't know that?
no, I sort of guessed it. It was just like,
Oh.
No, she's the nun who's running the school. She's like their teacher. They're not her children.
oh.
okay, I thought they were her.
Well, I'm glad we
children.
cleared that up. Okay, Oliver, go ahead.
Now a lot more of the Madeline books make sense. Why does this matter?
Why does this matter? Why does this matter? Because there is no special Christian track for your life. There's no way to become a super Christian by leaving the world behind or going to seminary and becoming a pastor. Now become a super Christian. No, you become a Christian by following Jesus. And it doesn't matter what your vocation is, you can follow Jesus well. This is what Luther taught very clearly. You don't have to join the monastery or a convent to follow Christ. You follow him in any vocation you have. So this is very important. Look on page 90, paragraphs 61 and 62, the last two paragraphs in the German side. There are so many ungodly notions and errors attached to monastic vows that they justify and make righteous before God. That's one big error. Second one, that they must be Christian perfection, that that's the way to become truly perfect. That's wrong. That through them, a person may keep both the counsels of the gospel and the commandments. So not only am I keeping the 10 commandments, but I'm even keeping the extra difficult rules that Jesus made, like turning the other cheek and giving up your property. Finally, that they contain works of supererogation beyond what is owed to God. So they had the idea that if you became a monk and did it well, not only did you earn your own salvation, but you might have even more good works than you need, and you can share your good works with other people. So they thought that you were being so good, you had more perfection than you even needed, and now you can let somebody else help benefit from your good works. Since then, all of this is false, useless, and humanly contrived. What does it mean when it says humanly contrived? What does that mean?
Made up by humans.
Yeah, made up by people. Monastic vows are null and void. That's pretty strong language. I see this was a big deal because at the time people thought, oh man, I made a vow to become a monk. I made a vow to become a nun. If I break that vow, I'm violating a promise I made to God. God's going to punish me. People were really afraid about this. And they thought, I can't go back on a vow I made. And some people said, even if the vow was wrong, I made a promise. How can I break my promise? And so that's why Luther and Melanchthon spent a long time teaching about this, to say, if you made a vow with a wrong understanding and you made a vow that was wrong, you not only can break it, but you must break it. And that was an important teaching for people to realize, oh, so if I leave the monastery or if I quit being a nun, I'm not violating a promise. I'm breaking a promise, but it was a bad promise, and so I need to break it. And that was the important teaching, because otherwise people's consciences were feeling really bad. They were feeling guilty, like, oh no, I haven't done the right thing. Oh no, I'm violating God's purposes. And so this was an important teaching. Titus, you can go ahead.
It wouldn't be funny if someone said, I have a brother who's in a monastery and he did a great job and he has some extra forgiveness. I can live an awful life and get some extra forgiveness.
Well, you see, that's not so far-fetched, because this was pretty common. In fact, still to this day, among some Roman Catholics, a lot of people, mothers and fathers, will be so excited if their son decides to become a priest, because yes, now my son is a priest, I'm in good with God. And there's still that idea very strong among some people who think that if they have a family member who becomes a priest or a nun, then that's good for them too. And if you give your son to the church, whew, that's a great thing for me. And that idea is still very much there. All right, Oliver?
2 things. First of all, Samuel's mother gave him to God, like giving him to the church.
That's right. And people liked that story. They say, look, this is what Hannah did with Samuel, so we should do the same thing. And the reformers had to say, well, Samuel's example is nice, but it doesn't mean we are required to, or that we're earning forgiveness by that. Go ahead, Oliver.
And Luther, when he left the monastery, obviously it's correct that the teachings were wrong, so it's pretty much going along with the teachings of the Roman Catholics.
Exactly. He's being quite consistent with himself. And he is saying, if we're going to start teaching the gospel, we need to start living the gospel. And one of the ways to live the gospel is to no longer live as monasteries or as convents and monasteries being some sort of special way to have God love us. Exactly right. Hadley.
Okay, in Sound of Music, so was it Sound of Music, did the nuns think it was wrong that she went off and married that old sailor guy?
Yeah, see, that's one of the big interesting stories about The Sound of Music, is this is all about nuns. Yeah, and there's another good example of nuns. All those long robes they're wearing, that's called their habits. Remember, they had those special hats and their faces, you know? So those are how nuns would dress. And those were Austrian nuns because they were living in Austria. And this is exactly the issue, because Maria was young and she said, I'm going to be a nun. I'm going to love God. I'm going to serve God my whole life. But then she went off as a nun, being sent to take care of these kids. That was going to be her job, to be a governess, to take care of these kids. But she ended up becoming a wife and a mother instead. And that was an important part of the story, is she's not going to be a nun anymore. And she never did take the vow to become a full nun. She was just what they call a novitiate, which means she's practicing, learning, thinking, but she hadn't taken her final vows. If she had, she would not have been able to marry Captain Von Trapp. But the fact is, she didn't take that final vow, and so she left the convent to go get married instead. Go ahead, Hadley.
All right, so this is a second, kind of going off that. When she was a nun, was she like So they sent her to be the governess to those kids so they could see what she was like. See how she
Yeah,
acted for them.
Well, the idea was that he didn't have a wife because his wife had died and the kids didn't have a mom. So they needed some nanny to come take care of them. So that's what she was being basically hired, was to be a nanny. But he tried to see if maybe somebody from the convent could send somebody who could take care of him for him. And so that's what makes the story kind of fun. All right, Oliver.
I don't think she was meant to be a nun.
That's one of the lines of the movie. Yes. I don't think she'll ever be a nun. That's right. Good. Jude?
I could tell she wasn't a real nun yet because she like tripped down the stairs, skipped up the mountain.
Yeah, right. That's why they had the song in there. What do you do with a problem like Maria? Because she wasn't being quite what a nun is supposed to be like. That's the whole point of the story. Hadley.
So, and do you like get to wear something special when you become a nun? Because Maria didn't wear the same clothes as the actual nuns.
Exactly.
And then, so there's like 3 levels of nuns: the Maria kind, the normal kind, and the high special kind. Get to wear the special stuff.
There are certain orders and ranks and different clothing you wear with that, just like with pastors and bishops and all that kind of stuff. Yes. All right, Oliver.
And all like that different clothing, none of that should be happening. If there's gonna be nuns, then even if they are gonna be nuns, there's no need for all those ranks and orders.
That's correct. All right. Good. Let's do our very last article, Article 28, which is called Concerning the Power of Bishops. Now remember, a bishop was a special kind of pastor who had even more authority than a regular pastor. And in Roman Catholicism, still to this day, they have a very set up hierarchy of authority. So you have parish pastors, then you have bishops over them. Over them, you have archbishops, then you have cardinals, and then you have the Pope himself. So that's the authority. In the Lutheran Church, we still have authority too. We don't call them the same thing. We have pastors, we have district presidents, and we have a synodical president. But in our understanding of authority, everyone has the same authority. We just let certain guys have different jobs for human arrangement. But in Catholic teaching, a bishop actually has more authority from God and more spiritual authority than a parish priest. And a pope has even more spiritual authority than a bishop. So that's what we're talking about, is the power of bishops with his special authority. Titus?
Why did he have a problem with bishops and not the Pope?
Well, bishop is a kind of code for pope. It's the same thing. It's anybody who's trying to have authority in the church. Bishop for the reformers meant anybody with churchly authority besides pastors or priests. Okay, Oliver?
So when the Latin text says concerning the church's power, but concerning the power of bishops, because bishops are really behind the church in the Roman Catholics, so it's really not much of a change between the two translations.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Because the bishops are the authority and they're the ones who are kind of running the church. That's right. So now the point here is this. What was going on? So here's the thing. What was going on was a lot of bishops were acting more like princes than like priests. So in other words, they were acting like secular authorities. They were acting like mayors or governors. Sometimes they were even acting like generals. Some bishops even had their own armies. Yeah, it's pretty weird. And they would sometimes have, a bunch of houses. They would own land and have people working for them. And the bishops would have sometimes a great deal of wealth, which is kind of funny because they're supposed to take a vow of poverty. And so there were lots and lots of inconsistencies and problems. And the biggest problem, though, was that bishops were not acting like bishops. Instead of taking care of the church and preaching the gospel, they were more interested in having power and authority in the world and accumulating wealth and stretching their power further. So that became a big problem. And so the whole point then, what was going on was bishops that were abusing their power. And then the other problem then is they weren't doing what they should do, which was provide pastors and teaching and a good example for the churches. They were doing the wrong things and not the right things. Okay, Hadley, go ahead.
Okay. So in a book I read like something, but it was like a story about this woman who wanted to be pope, and the popes are super rich, so that's why everybody wants to be pope, you know?
Right.
And should I write that like bishops act like government sort type people?
That's right. That's right. And so it's kind of ironic because the Pope is supposed to be a man who takes a vow of poverty and chastity and obedience. And priests had to take that vow too. And so the Pope is supposed to take that vow, and so are the bishops. And yet many of them were very wealthy and living very comfortable lives, living like kings, as the reformers would put it. Go ahead, Oliver.
Does it matter because the Pope should be leading a poor life and not being like all rich and fancy and powerful? Now,
right.
I'm also going to say there's nothing wrong with being like all rich and powerful. They took the vows though. That is what is wrong.
Correct. Having power when it comes from God and you have a responsibility, it's your vocation, okay. And having wealth isn't necessarily bad either. You have to be very careful what you do with that wealth. And you have to watch out because wealth can be very tempting and get you into trouble. Go ahead, Jude.
Also, Gregory the Great was a great example of a pope.
Yes, Gregory the Great from way back in the early church fathers was a good example of somebody who was trying to be faithful in his example and his teaching of the church. Good. Titus?
Yeah, Daddy owns an army. Yeah.
Right. All right. Good.
Army of 4 boys.
An army of 4 boys. Yes, that's fair. All right, good. Now let's go to page 98, paragraphs 53 and 54 or so on the German side again. How then should Sunday and other similar church ordinances and ceremonies be regarded? Our people reply that bishops or pastors may make regulations for the sake of good order in the church, but not thereby to obtain God's grace, to make satisfaction for sin, or to bind consciences, nor to regard such a service of God, or to consider it a sin when these rules are broken without giving offense. So in other words, bishops were making a lot of rules for the people. You have to fast, you have to make a pilgrimage, you can't do this, you have to do this. And what the reformers are saying is they can make certain guidelines and directions for their people, like you should come to church and worship piously. But they can't make rules that bind consciences, and they can't make rules that say we're going to forgive your sins by doing this. That's the big problem. Oliver, go ahead.
When was Saturday worship turned to Sunday worship?
Yeah, well, that's a good thing to talk about. That's a much longer discussion, but the quick answer is that God commanded the 7th day of Sabbath, and so the Israelites always worshiped on Friday evening into Saturday because that was the 7th day, started at sunset on Friday. And then the early church said, yeah, keeping one day to worship God is a great idea, but you know what? Jesus rose on Sunday, and that's like the new creation. I think we should worship on Sunday because that's the day that Jesus came back to life. And so every single Sunday is like a little Easter, and that's why we worship on Sunday, because that's when Christ rose from the dead. Jude.
But Lent Sundays are not little Easters.
Well, even Lenten Sundays are little Easters because that's why you still celebrate the Lord's Supper, and it's a little bit of a reprieve from the regular days. And that's why the 40 days of Lent don't include Sundays, because Sundays are not technically ever part of Lent. They're Sundays in Lent, but they're not Sundays of Lent. Go ahead, Jude.
Our devotion for Lent had Sundays devotions.
Right. And so, yeah, because we think about those days, they still have a certain kind of flavor to them. That's why we don't say Alleluia during Lent. And yet the Sundays in Lent aren't technically part of Lent, because Sunday can never be a day for fasting. It's a day to celebrate Christ's resurrection. Hadley.
So on Sundays on Lent, this is kind of hard. So it's almost like Lent is a lot of short little 6 days, because it's not one big season, because there's little interruptions in between. There's a lot of short little 6-day periods.
That's kind of right. Yeah, it's a bunch of 6-day periods. All right, let's go to page 104. And here's where Melanchthon writes his second conclusion about all of these articles, what's going on. And then we have all the signatures, and these are the people who signed it. So your imperial majesty's most humble obedient servants. So remember, these are all the servants of the Emperor Charles. So they're all trying to be nice to him because he's still the emperor. So who signs it? John, Duke of Saxony, the elector, and George, Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach, Ernest, Duke of Lunenburg, Philip, Landgrave of Hesse, John Frederick, Duke of Saxony, Francis, Duke of Lunenburg, Wolfgang, Prince of Anhalt, the mayor and council of Nuremberg, and the mayor and council of Reutlingen. So there's all the people who signed it.
What about Luther?
Luther didn't sign it. Melanchthon didn't sign it. No theologian signed it. Only the princes and the electors and the city officials, because this was a political state issue, not a church issue, about what's going on up there, and the emperor wanted to know. So it's very interesting. All these theologians were involved, but no theologian signed it, not the original. Now, later on, all kinds of people signed it, and even technically, I signed it when I became a pastor, when I was ordained, and your dad signed it because we subscribed to the Augsburg Confession. We subscribed to the Book of Concord, which means we wrote our name under. And so even though there's no physical copy of the Augsburg Confession, I had to write my name. We do that by making a promise that my teaching will be this teaching. And so I subscribed to this. And question I have for you guys today is, are you ready to add your name to the list?
Yeah.
Ready to put your name on and say, I believe these things. That's my teaching too. And that's been the whole idea, guys. Good. All right. Final questions. Hadley.
On page 105, there is another list and has some different, some same.
What'd you say about page 105?
There's another list, and it has some of like Imperial Majesty, John Frederick, George, but it has different names on it too.
Well, actually, the names are all the same right down the list. They're all the same exact people. They just describe them a little differently. Like look underneath Ernest on page 105. It says Ernest with his own hand. What does that mean?
He wrote himself.
He signed it himself. He didn't let Melanchthon write his name. He wrote his own name with his own hand and his own pen. So he wrote it himself. And so that's what that means. So it's the same people. They just have different names a little bit.
I bet he's quite proud. Like, I signed this with
That's
my
right. I'm willing to, and these guys, when they signed it, they didn't know. It could be the emperor would say, fine, then I sentence you all to death because you're all heretics. That could have happened because Luther had been called a heretic, which meant he could have been killed on sight. That's why he wasn't in Augsburg for this meeting, because the reformers were afraid that he would get killed if he went to Augsburg and the emperor would have him arrested, which could have happened. And these guys, for all they knew, they could have been arrested too. And that's how courageous they were. They were willing to tell the emperor, this is what I believe, do what you need to do. They weren't afraid, which is pretty cool. These guys were pretty brave, and they put their confession right where it needed to be. And even though that might have been scary, they did it anyway. Titus?
Can you add your name to the list if you're not a pastor?
Technically, in our church body, only pastors and congregations subscribe. But you can certainly subscribe and say, this is my promise, and I'm going to live this way my whole life. You can make that promise.
Yeah.
It'd be between you and God, and you can do that. Oliver.
So, if Luther came and Luther signed, then the whoever was reading it, the king with the emperor, he would probably have killed all the guys there on site.
He might have. Who knows what might have happened?
That Luther was more behind this if he saw that he signed it.
That might be. They probably knew Luther was behind it because they knew it was his teaching, but he might have fired him up a little bit more even. Oliver?
And also, when you do confirmation, that's sort of stating sort of the same thing, that you're going to keep this teaching.
Yes, confirmation is learning the teachings of the church, and when you get confirmed, you're promising, I'm going to hold to these teachings. But when you get confirmed, you only promise to uphold the small catechism, and you're getting taught a whole lot more. So you can say, I think at my confirmation, I want you to tell me to subscribe to the small catechism and the whole book of Concord. You could do that if you wanted to. But in confirmation, we have people only subscribe to the small catechism. And that's good too. All right, guys, we're out of time and we're all done. So this is our last class period. We got all the way through the Augsburg Confession, and now you guys are good theologians. So keep on being good Lutheran theologians and practice all that you've
17
learned.
lessons.
What?
In 17 lessons.
In 17 lessons and a whole lot more than that, class meetings. All right. Good job, guys. Papa loves you. Well done.